Bridget Smith had one rule. Know your place. Do not dare forget it. Isabella had obeyed that rule without fail for 3 years, and somehow, he still saw through her. She knelt at the kitchen hearth in the grey hour before dawn, her hands cracked and reddened, her apron rough against her skin. The fire needed laying. The floors needed scrubbing. This was what remained of Isabella Smith: ash, silence, and the smell of cold stone. A garment chosen specifically to remind her, and everyone else, of exactly where she now stood. Bridget had called it practical. Isabella knew it was simply the uniform of erasure. This morning, however, something in the manor felt different. The housemaids were whispering. Cook had polished the silver twice. Bridget had appeared at breakfast in her finest navy gown, her pearls gleaming, her posture rigid with the particular tension of a woman performing a confidence she did not entirely feel. The Duke of Birmingham was expected. Above her, Cassandra's footsteps crossed the landing. On the drive, carriage wheels met gravel. Isabella did not look up. She was not permitted to. But her hands went perfectly still. She had learned to move through Ashford Manor like water, finding the lowest path, making no sound, leaving no trace. 3 years of practice had made her efficient. It had not made her forget. The scullery was the coldest room in the house. Even in the thin light of early spring, the stone floor pulled the warmth from her feet through the worn soles of her boots. She worked quickly, the grates, the ash pails, the copper pots lined up along the shelf like soldiers awaiting inspection. Her hands knew the routine before her mind was fully awake. At the far end of the corridor, just visible through the service door she was careful never to open too wide, hung her father's portrait. Lord Edmund Smith, painted in his 43rd year, his hand resting on the arm of a chair, his expression carrying that particular quality of quiet certainty she had spent her whole childhood trying to emulate. She was not permitted to linger near it. Bridget had never stated the rule outright. She had simply made the consequences of forgetting it clear enough. She heard Bridget before she saw her, the measured click of heels on marble, deliberate and proprietorial. Then her stepmother's voice, directing a housemaid toward the east drawing room with the brisk authority of a woman who needed everyone around her to remain convinced of her rightful place. Bridget's reign was a performance, Isabella had long since concluded. Meticulous, paranoid, and brittle beneath the surface. Then, from the top of the staircase, Cassandra appeared. She was dressed in pale rose silk, a gown Isabella recognized from her mother's own trunk, altered now to fit different shoulders entirely. Cassandra did not look down. She never did. Isabella returned to the copper pots and kept her face still. She knew who she was. She had simply learned not to say it aloud. The Duke of Birmingham arrived at 10:30, precise as a court summons. Isabella heard the carriage first, the sharp crack of the horses slowing on the gravel, the footman's boots on the front steps. She did not go to look. She had been assigned the drawing room instead, fresh coals for the fire, the tea things arranged, and herself gone before the company arrived. Bridget had been very particular about that last part. She was not quite quick enough. She had just set the coal scuttle down when the door opened behind her and Bridget swept in, her smile already arranged, her voice already performing. "Your Grace, what a tremendous honor. Ashford is entirely at your disposal." Isabella kept her back turned, her hands steady, reaching for the poker with the unhurried movements of someone who had learned that stillness was its own form of invisibility. She almost made it. "You there." The voice was low and even, carrying no particular force, and yet it stopped her completely. She turned. Duke Henry Richard stood just inside the doorway, still in his traveling coat, and he was looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her. At her. His gaze moved briefly to her hands, red and raw against the black iron of the poker, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Who is this?" he asked, the question directed at Bridget but his eyes not moving. "One of the house girls," Bridget said. Quickly. Too quickly. Henry said nothing. He simply filed it away behind those steady dark eyes and moved further into the room. That evening, he passed Isabella in the corridor. She curtsied without looking up, as she had been trained. She heard his footsteps slow, then stop entirely. When she finally reached the servant's stair, she could still feel his gaze at her back, quiet, deliberate, and entirely unlike anything she had felt in 3 years. Like being seen, she thought, and did not know what to do with it. He came back the next morning. Not to the drawing room, where Bridget had arranged a carefully staged breakfast and positioned Cassandra at the window in her second-best gown. He came to the east corridor, where Isabella was relining the hall lamps, her back straight and her movements efficient and her eyes, as always, directed precisely nowhere. He asked the footman something about the east wing. The footman did not know the answer. A silence followed, and then, without looking up from the lamp in her hands, Isabella supplied it. The original East Wing had been commissioned in 1743, she said. Structural additions followed in 1779, funded through the surplus of the Hartfield land agreements, the same agreements, she believed, that His Grace had come to review. The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. She heard herself. Felt the words hanging in the air between them, too precise, too fluent, too deeply particular for a girl who was supposed to know nothing beyond the weight of a coal scuttle. She set the lamp down carefully and reached for the next one, her face composed. "Is that so?" His voice was measured, giving nothing away. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." She kept her eyes down. "I must have heard it mentioned in the household." A beat of quiet. Then, by whom, precisely? She had no answer for that. She could feel him watching her, not with suspicion, but with the focused, unhurried attention of a man assembling pieces of something he did not yet fully understand. He did not press her further. He simply remained where he was a moment longer than necessary, and when he finally moved away down the corridor, the quality of the silence he left behind had changed. Something had shifted between them, unnamed, unacknowledged, and now impossible to unfind. She had not heard him come in. That was the only explanation, the only acceptable one, for why she was still sitting at the kitchen table when the Duke of Birmingham appeared in the larder doorway, still in his shirt sleeves, a candle in his hand, and stopped. The hour was late. The house was quiet. Isabella had permitted herself, as she sometimes did when the day's work was finally done and the manor had settled into sleep, the small private luxury of her book. It was slim, leather-worn at the corners, the pages dense with Latin verse and the fine, careful marginalia of a girl who had once had a tutor and the freedom to disagree with him. She had not put it away in time. Henry's gaze moved from her face to the book, and back again. She did not flee. There was nowhere to go. He crossed the kitchen without invitation and sat down across from her, setting his candle between them. He nodded once toward the volume. "Ovid." "Virgil," she said quietly. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, exactly. More like the satisfaction of a man whose suspicion has just been confirmed. He said nothing for a moment, and the silence was not unkind. "You annotate in the margins," he observed. "I disagree with him occasionally." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that men who have never lost anything tend to write about loss rather cleanly." It came out before she could measure it. She looked down at the page. But Henry did not look away. "What did you lose?" he asked. His voice was low, carrying no pressure, only the straightforward gravity of a man who intended the question genuinely. She was quiet for a long time. "Everything," she said at last. Gradually, and then all at once. She did not tell him the rest. But for the first time in 3 years, she had not pretended there was nothing to tell. Something passed between them in the candlelight, careful, fragile, and entirely real. He found the portrait gallery by accident, or so he told himself. He had taken a wrong turn from the East Wing, the same East Wing whose history Isabella had recited with the fluency of inheritance rather than service, and pushed open a door to find himself in a long, narrow corridor lined with paintings. The afternoon light fell grey and even through the high windows, illuminating the succession of Smith family faces in their gilded frames with the impartiality of a court of law. He walked slowly, reading the plaques. Then he stopped. The painting was not large. A girl of perhaps 10, seated at a piano, her posture straight and unself-conscious, her expression carrying the particular seriousness of a child who has been asked to sit still and has decided to make the stillness her own. Lord Edmund Smith stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder with a tenderness so unguarded it was almost difficult to look at directly. The plaque read, "Lord Edmund Smith and daughter. Ashford Manor, 1802. The girl had Isabella's eyes. Henry stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned to go and find Bridget. He found Isabella instead. She was at the far end of the corridor, half in shadow, her arms folded across her chest, not in defiance but in the manner of someone holding themselves together by habit. She was looking at the painting from a distance of perhaps 20 feet. The precise distance, Henry understood with a sudden cold clarity, of someone who had learned exactly how close she was permitted to come. She saw him see it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The corridor held its breath around them. "That is you," he said finally. It was not a question. Isabella looked at him for a long time, measuring something, weighing the cost of it. Then, very quietly, it was 2 words. Carrying the full weight of everything 3 years of silence had buried. Henry did not look away. "Tell me," he said simply. And for the first time, she almost did. He rode to the solicitor's office the following morning without telling anyone where he was going. Mr. Aldous Pennick occupied a set of rooms above a stationer's shop in the village, his practice modest and his manner that of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had begun to lose feeling in his arms. He was old, precise, and when Henry stated his purpose, a review of the full Ashford estate documentation, beginning with Lord Edmund's original will, something in the solicitor's face did not so much change as release, like a knot worked loose after years of stubborn tightening. The original will was produced within minutes. It had not been misfiled. It had not been lost. It had simply been waiting, with the patient resignation of a document that knows its moment will come eventually. Isabella Smith. Named. Unambiguous. The sole primary heir to Ashford Manor and its full holdings. The addendum was produced next, the instrument that had redirected everything to Bridget. Henry read it twice, slowly. It was dated 3 months after Lord Edmund's death. The signature at the bottom bore a passing resemblance to the one on the original will in the same way that a forgery always does, close enough to suggest, insufficient to withstand scrutiny. Henry set it beside the original and looked at them together for a long, quiet moment. He thanked Mr. Pennick, asked him to retain both documents under seal, and rode back to Ashford. He said nothing to Bridget. He accepted her hospitality at dinner with the same measured courtesy he had maintained all week, and gave her no indication that anything had changed. Afterward, he found Isabella in the garden. She was kneeling beside a rose bed along the south wall, her hands in the soil, her movements unhurried, tending the flowers with the particular care of someone maintaining a connection they were not permitted to name openly. Her father's roses. Henry recognized them from the portrait's background without needing to be told. He stopped beside her. "Did you know?" he asked simply. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The evening light was soft, and her expression held none of its usual careful guardedness, only a tiredness so old it had settled into something resembling calm. "I knew," she said. "I just didn't believe anyone else would." Henry held her gaze steadily. "They will now," he said. Henry requested the household assemble at 10 o'clock. "Estate business," he said. "Routine matters. Nothing more." Bridget arrived last, deliberately. Isabella understood. Her navy gown was immaculate, her pearls gleaming, her composure arranged with the practiced confidence of a woman who had never seriously entertained the possibility of losing. She took her place at the head of the table without invitation and folded her hands and waited. Isabella sat near the door, where she always sat today. Hands in her lap. Eyes down. Henry placed the documents on the table without ceremony or preamble. The original will. The addendum. The solicitor's letter. He said nothing, allowing the room to absorb what it was looking at. Bridget's confidence lasted perhaps 10 seconds before it curdled into something sharper. She rose from her chair, one hand extending toward Isabella like an accusation given physical form, her voice assuming the absolute authority that had governed this household for 3 years. "Tell them what you are," she said. "Tell them your place in this house." The room held its breath. Isabella's head dropped, the old reflex, the deeply worn groove of 3 years of diminishment pulling at her before she had consciously decided to move. Then Henry stepped forward. He placed himself between them with the quiet, immovable finality of a man who has made a decision and will not be revisited on it. He did not look at Bridget. He turned to Isabella not with pity, not with rescue, but with the steady certainty of someone who already knows the truth and is simply waiting for her to claim it. "Miss Smith," he said quietly, "I believe this house has been waiting for you to speak." One long, trembling moment of silence. Isabella lifted her head and spoke. She spoke quietly. That was what no one expected, not an outburst, not 3 years of grief released all at once, but a steady, unhurried voice that grew more certain with every word. She named the forgery, the mismatched date, the signature that was not her father's hand. She named the deliberate, methodical process by which a daughter had been converted, piece by piece, into a servant in her own home. Then she spoke her father's name aloud in his own house for the first time since his death. "I am Isabella Smith. I am his daughter. And this is my home." Bridget's composure did not shatter. It simply emptied the authority, the performance, the 3 years of manufactured certainty draining from her face until what remained was something small and frightened and exposed. Behind her, Cassandra made a broken sound. She did not defend her mother. She looked at Isabella with the stricken expression of someone finally understanding the full weight of what they had allowed, and wept not from self-pity, but from genuine, belated shame. The legal matter resolved swiftly. By late afternoon, Bridget had been escorted from Ashford with the diminished bearing of a woman reduced to exactly what she deserved. The house settled into a silence entirely unlike any Isabella had known in 3 years, not the silence of suppression, but of something finally at rest. Henry found her in the garden, standing among her father's roses. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I feel like I can breathe," she said. He turned to face her plainly, no ceremony, no performance. He told her he was not a man of poetic declarations, but he was entirely, unmovably certain of her. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, standing in the garden that was finally, irrevocably hers again. 1 year later, the roses along the south wall were in full bloom. Ashford Manor had not changed in its bones, the same long corridors, the same mahogany banister, the same morning light falling through the east wing windows in long, unhurried diagonals. What had changed was the quality of the silence within it. It breathed differently now. Easier. Like a house that had been holding itself carefully for a very long time and had finally been given permission to rest. The portrait gallery had been restored. Her father's paintings rehung in their proper order, the gaps filled, the corridor returned to what it had always been meant to be. At the far end, a new portrait had been added, Isabella, painted in the same steady light as her father's, her expression carrying something that had taken her the better part of a year to fully reclaim. Not performance. Simply presence. Cassandra had written in the autumn a single careful letter, genuinely meant. Isabella had answered it with the same grace she had always possessed and never been credited for. Bridget had retreated into obscurity somewhere in the north. It was, Isabella had decided, justice enough. Their life, hers and Henry's, was not one of grand spectacle. It was estate rides at dawn and evenings by the fire. It was a man who brought her the correspondence before any secretary saw it and asked her opinion on every matter of consequence, and listened, and remembered what she said. It was quiet, and honest, and entirely real. That evening, Isabella took her place at the head of her father's table. Not performing. Not enduring. Not disappearing into the edges of a room that belonged to someone else. Simply present, in the home that had always been hers. It turned out that a person's birthright was not only what was written in a will. It was the quiet, unbreakable knowledge of who you are and the extraordinary grace of being seen, fully and without question, by someone who never doubted it for a single moment.